The history of video games is commonly divided into 7 generations. This timeline only takes video game consoles into consideration, since video game actually began in the decade of 1960. The technology used in the games has been developed ever since, as we're gonna show now. The first generation started when the Odyssey console was released. It was very primitive and wasn't very successful in its attempt to popularize virtual gaming. However, it introduced the father of all games, the well-known Pong. The second generation is represented mainly by the Atari, ColecoVision, and Magnavox Odyssey 2 consoles. They all featured primitive pixelated graphics which barely resembled the images that they wanted to represent. At that time, games were not so complex, being most of the time about shooting random enemies or avoiding obstacles in a repetitive maze. These include some famous titles such as Pac-Man, Asteroids, Frogger, and the first Donkey Kong game, in which DK and Mario first showed up. Even though it's very primitive, the Atari is still considered one of the best video game consoles of all times. The third generation has no beginning and end dates because its games and consoles, even though obsolete nowadays, are still played by the old school gamers. This also applies for the next generations, which consoles are still spread worldwide. Some consoles have been even re-released recently, like Master System. Other than this one, the other main console of the third generation is the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as NES or Famicom. These consoles made a revolution in video game graphics and gameplay. For the first time, games used pre-rendered images for characters and backgrounds, bringing these graphics to a new and higher standard. Some famous games first appeared in this generation, like Castlevania, Mega Man, and even Super Mario himself. The fourth generation is represented by the SNES and Mega Drive consoles. The game companies developed new technologies which made the usage of more complex graphics possible. The consoles used a new 16-bit graphics processor instead of the 8-bit ones from the third generation consoles. The Nintendo and Sega companies were rivals at that time, which created a rush for developing new high-quality games with astonishing graphics, giving us famous titles like Sonic, Street Fighter, Streets of Rage, Mortal Kombat, and even more Mario games. The fifth generation introduces 3D gaming to video game consoles. Games had a tendency to no longer stick to the old 2D screen, porting themselves to a virtual three-dimensional world. At this time, the most famous consoles were the Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation, known nowadays as PS1. Since games were no more limited by 2D views, it was possible to develop better gameplay and visual effects. Some titles at this time were Resident Evil, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Need for Speed, and Tekken. This generation also started the usage of CDs instead of the old cartridges to store games, therefore introducing the usage of memory cards to store saved data. The sixth generation is the current generation of video game consoles. It is represented by the well-known PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube consoles. The improvement in graphics and gameplay was again an astonishing revolution. This has caused video games to become more popular among adults due to adult-themed and somehow violent games such as Grand Theft Auto, also known as GTA. Due to the excessive size and amount of resources needed to run the games, the media used now is the DVD. Another great improvement in games was the massive usage of engines which simulate real-world physics, making games even more real. Some titles are Max Payne, Hitman, and newer versions of the Prince of Persia franchise. The seventh generation release date is approaching. Next month, the PlayStation 3 and Nintendo Wii will be released to the public. The Xbox 360 is already available for purchase. This generation is gonna recreate the whole concept of gaming due to its extreme graphical capabilities, real physics simulations, and revolutionary gameplay. In the handheld area, the Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable consoles have brought this kind of gaming to a new level due to their touchscreen and MP4 video support respectively.